Okay, and we're going to get through our next chapter now on, there we go, on public opinion. Just a reminder, I'm going to post your third quiz. It's going to be posted Tuesday morning, and you'll have until Friday to finish taking that. Don't forget, each quiz is about 5% of your grade, You have 4 of them to equal 20% of your grade. And then your second exam is going to be posted next week. So your exam will be same as your first, same format, and it will be posted next Monday, and you'll have all week to take that. Don't forget, all of your exams are 20% of your grade. And next week, I will also post your essay prompt. Your essay prompt is also 20% of your grade. See where I'm going here? It will be posted next week, and you will have until the last day of class to submit it. So you can submit it as early as you want or as late as you want up until the last day of class. I will post the instructions, and then there will be just a field below it, just the same way we do our response questions, where you will copy and paste your essay into that response section. There's not really a good way of sending it like in the Microsoft Word format, so just copy and paste it in. And I know sometimes you lose some of your formatting that way, but that's okay. Like, I'm more interested in your content than your format. Okay, all right, so let's dive into the chapter on public opinion. I'm sorry if you hear my 3 children upstairs playing. It's a little bit loud, but that's okay. We'll get through. All right, so public opinion. What's at stake when we move to a more direct democracy? In June of 2016, we're going to talk a little bit about what happened with the Brexit. In 2016, the United Kingdom had this non-binding but politically important referendum, which was a popular vote to be held on whether the United Kingdom, which is England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Gibraltar, would retain its membership in the European Union, which is an economic and political union of 28 European countries that dated in some form back to the days after World War II. UK's always been a little bit aloof from the rest of Europe. They never adopted the euro as their currency. They're concerned with immigration. The EU allows for free travel between the number of states, and many young Brits had immigrated to EU countries, and their counterparts settled in the United Kingdom. They also feared terrorists from like Syria and etc. would have easier access to their shores. So the Brexit, the British exit, polls showed that public opinion favored remaining in the EU, which was shared by the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron. He held the vote to just appeal to his opponents. But then the Brexit votes actually won with about 51.9% of the vote. David Cameron resigned, and many of the Brits were expressing misgivings about the way they'd voted, since they previously had been kind of more loose with the facts. Theresa May then became the prime minister. She began to negotiate a deal with Europe that would lessen the fallout, perhaps even find a way for for the UK to stay in the EU. After all, it is a whole process, and I think it's still ongoing. Referenda like this can have unexpected consequences. I'm going to let the dog in because he really barked throughout our lecture yesterday. Referenda can have unexpected consequences. You think you know what's going to happen when you hold these votes, but you don't always. Are they a good idea? Letting people decide is an attractive idea in a country like the United States that prides itself on democracy. But how much responsibility do you want to take for the way you are governed? Most of us are pretty comfortable with the idea that we should vote on for those who make our rules, but how about voting on the rules themselves? Do we care enough or know enough to vote on laws for the country as a whole? Should we be governed more by public opinion than by the opinions of our leaders? It's fashionable to denounce a public opinion poll. 65% of them think that polls are only right some of the time, and politicians are leery or even scornful of polls. But what's so bad about being ruled about by the polls in a democracy, which is supposed to be ruled by the people? If politics is about who gets what and how, shouldn't we care about what the who thinks? Public opinion, that's the collective attitudes and beliefs of individuals on one or more issues. It's what the public thinks. So public opinion polls are going to be scientific efforts to estimate what an entire group thinks about an issue by asking a smaller sample size of the group for its opinion. This is nothing more than a scientific effort to measure the public's opinion. We want to believe that what we think matters. We'd also like to think that our elected officials are guided by unwavering principles. Public opinion is important in democracy for two different reasons. Normative reasons and empirical reasons. Normative means we believe public opinion should influence what a government does. Empirical reasons mean that a lot of people behave as though public opinion does matter. So to the degree that they measure, record, and react to it, it does become a factor in American politics. America's founding is about the idea of the rejection of the aristocracy and the monarchy and the rise of popular sovereignty, the idea that people matter above all. The presence of the people is pervasive in documents and narratives that create and support the American government. The Declaration of Independence says the consent of the governed. The Constitution says we the people. The Gettysburg Address says the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The very legitimacy of the United States government rests on the idea that government exists to serve the interests of its citizens. Since our founding, there's been a shift in the greater role of citizenry in politics. The Seventh Amendment took the election of the Senate from the state legislatures to the citizens of the states. State politics are instruments of direct democracy that allow citizens to vote on policies and remove officials from office. How do we determine whose voices should be heard? Different ideas of democracy prescribe different roles for the people, in part because those theories disagree about how competent the citizens of a country are to govern themselves. Elitists say citizens are maybe too ignorant or too ill-informed to be trusted with major political decisions. Proponents of a participatory democracy have faith that the people are both smart enough and able to gather enough information to be effective decision makers. But as Americans, we're confused about what the role of a democratic citizen should be. Should it be the virtuous citizen who's concerned for the common good, who recognizes that democracy carries obligations as well as rights? Or Americans apolitical, self-interested actors? We're probably both, right? When voting on major bills, members of Congress worry quite a lot about the public opinion in their districts because they elect them. The president usually has an in-house paid public opinion expert. The public may act as if it's not paying attention, but it can act decisively if the provocation is sufficient. We've seen this a lot lately, right? And then, the book even talks about the 2006 midterm elections. Voters showed frustration with the war in Iraq by giving control of the House and Senate to the Democrats. And the same thing is happening now. We showed frustration with the current president or the previous president by electing a new president this year. That's how politics works. Americans hold two different views on what citizenship is all about, but usually we're somewhere in the middle. For example, some citizens tune out political news but are tolerant of others, vote regularly. Many activist citizens are informed, opinionated, and participatory, but maybe are intolerant of other views, which can make democratic politics difficult. There are three elements of an ideal citizen. They would have political knowledge, they would have tolerance, and they would participate. Which one of those is the most important? Political knowledge. The ideal democratic citizen understands how the government works. You guys are learning this now. Who the main actors are, what major principles underlie the operation of political systems. But American actors are not very well informed about their political system. Knowledge is key to know for whom to thank or for whom to blame for government policy. This is key information for holding officials accountable. Virtually anyone can name who our president is right now, but few can name other offices. Who is our Supreme Court Chief Justice? It's John Roberts. Is he conservative or liberal? He's conservative. Who controls the House of Representatives right now? Democrats. Who's the Speaker of the House? Nancy Pelosi. These are things that a well-informed person, a well-informed citizen would know. And you guys know now because you've taken this class. A key demographic also is tolerance. People jockey for position and competing visions of common good, of tolerance for ideas different than one's own, and respect for the rights of others to provide oil to keep the democratic machinery running smoothly. Tolerance is a prerequisite for compromise, which is an essential part of politics. We have a history of denying in America basic civil rights to some groups, but tolerance in general is on the rise since the civil rights movement of the 60s. Participation is the third element of this. One of the most consistent criticisms of Americans by those concerned with democratic health of the nation is that we don't participate enough, which is usually correct. Voter turnout in the United States ranks among the lowest among industrialized nations. You guys, it's so important to vote. It is so important to vote. Greater levels of participation are generally seen among those with more education and higher income. But everybody should exercise their right, no matter what. I feel that very strongly. The elements of an ideal democratic citizen are not distributed equally across the population, which forces us to bring a consensus on the basics of a political culture and more complex forces that guide us into adopting a more divisive ideology. Democracies depend on each new generation picking up the values and allegiances of previous generations, beliefs in the legitimacy of the political system and its leaders, and a willingness to obey the laws and commands of those leaders. The children in France or China support their leaders just as surely as do the children of the United States. Political socialization is the process by which we learn our political orientations and allegiances. This is transferred from generation to generation. We learn patriotism and good citizenships early on through agents like family, school, church. All of these have an interest in turning out well-behaved children with loyalty to our country. Family is probably the biggest influence on our political development. Kids develop an emotional response to some fundamental object of government because they really understand much about before they really understand much about those objects. They learn that police are good in most communities, that the president is important, that the flag deserves respect. Then you have my kids who were born in the Washington, D.C. area who can, name a lot more than most 4-year-olds, 2-year-olds, and, well, my 1-year-old can't really name it yet. But schools are where most kids begin their day. The Pledge of Allegiance, something they learn very early on. My children learned it at the age of 3. It's important agents of political learning and development of citizen orientations. The groups we belong to also foster our basic values. Peer groups have influence on social and political attitudes, as do individuals who live in your neighborhood. This can be traced somewhat to the way people kind of select themselves into groups, but they're also reinforced by social contracts and social media connections that allow us to expand the number of peers we can contact to build on and participate in the stories about who we are. The process of talking, working, and worshiping together lead us to see the world similarly. Then there's something called the spiral of silence. This is the process by which a majority opinion becomes exaggerated because those who don't share that opinion often don't feel comfortable speaking out in opposition. The minority sometimes will silence themselves in the face of the majority consensus. It tends to embolden the advocates of the majority opinion to speak even more confidently. Political socialization produces a citizenry that largely agrees with the rules of the game and accepts the outcomes of the national political process as legitimate. But it doesn't mean that our nation is in agreement on most things, or even very many things. As we get older and are exposed to more things, our opinions become more complex. Demographics, partisanship, ideology, education, economic self-interest, and religion, as well as where we live, these all affect the way we come to see politics, what we believe we have as a stake in the political process, and the kind of citizenship we practice. We move from consensus on the basics of American political culture to more divisive beliefs. Divisive beliefs work against the positive feelings toward our government we build in our early years. Occasionally, we solidify behind our government and our leaders, especially when we believe maybe we're under threat, like in the days after 9/11. But otherwise, our trust in the government reflects the divisions in our opinions and our loyalties to subgroups in the population. We're seeing that a lot right now. Some of the most significant effects of the Obama presidency were to provide the opportunity for African American children to realize that the American dream of growing up to be president actually belongs to them too. This is also happening now with Kamala Harris as our first female and our first African American vice president. It's making children realize that their dreams can belong to anybody. Race has been a more divisive than unifying point in our country. Only recently are we starting to sort of level that playing field. Social issues like abortion and prayer in school, you kind of see racial differences muted a little more, but typically African Americans tend to be more liberal than whites. African Americans are the most solidly Democratic group in both terms of party identification and in voting. Interestingly, as income and other status indicators rise for whites, they become more conservative and more Republican, but the same thing doesn't happen for blacks. And it's interesting how that usually happens. For many years, gender has almost had no predictive power in opinions and behaviors, except for women were usually less active in politics and usually less warlike in their political attitudes. But since the 60s, there's been a revolution, and women have gained more education, entered the workforce more, increased their levels in participation in politics. And over the last century, women's attitudes on issues have diverged. There's kind of a gender gap, the tendency of men and women to differ in their political views on some issues. Women are typically more liberal than men, but then there's something called the marriage gap, which is the tendency for married people to hold political opinions that differ for those people who've never married. Married people tend to be more traditional and conservative than those who are not. And then stages of life. As people change their opinions as they age, experiences over time affects how we see the political world. There's little evidence, though, that people progress from youthful idealism to mature conservatism. Only small differences in policy preferences are related to age, except for in political engagement. Middle age and older citizens are typically more attentive to and more active in politics. They vote more often. They contribute more to campaigns. This is related more to settling down, marrying, having children, establishing a career. Obama, though, brought a large number of young people to the polls. Political generations are groups of citizens whose political views have been shaped by the common events of their youth. Growing up in the years after 9/11 gave a generation a set of values as surely as having grown up during the Civil Rights Movement, during World War II, during the Great Depression. As older groups die, overall opinion among the citizenry changes. This is a process of generational replacement. Much of the division in contemporary public opinion can be described as ideological, liberal or conservative, or partisan, Democrat or Republican terms. Party identification refers to our relatively enduring allegiances to one of the major political parties. Part of what defines us and comes from our very early years, party labels provide mental cues that we use in interpreting and responding to personalities and news. This influences how we see a political world. We resolve uncertainty about new policies or personalities, even though objective events to be consistent with our partisanship. We see the world through a very partisan lens. And then there's something called partisan sorting, which is the process through which citizens align themselves ideologically with one of the two parties, leaving fewer citizens remaining in the center and increasing party polarization. The average Democrat and Republican are much farther apart ideologically now than it has been the case in previous decades. The impact on politics has been quite profound. Fewer people swing between candidates. Fewer people come to elections with a fully open mind. This makes it easier to demonize the opposition. This contributes to the nastiness, the anger, the general incivility of contemporary politics, which in turn has contributed to citizens' disgust with politics in general and the rising levels of distrust in government. Separating citizens into democratic enlightenment and democratic engagement. Democratic enlightenment refers to a citizen's ability to hold democratic beliefs, including the idea that politics is about compromise, and sometimes the needs of the community will conflict with and overrides one individual preferences. And then democratic engagement refers to a citizen's ability to understand his or her own interests and how to pursue those interests in politics. Both dimensions are boosted by education. Better educated citizens are more likely to be informed about politics, to be more tolerant, committed to democratic principles, and they tend to vote and participate at all levels. Then there's something called economic self-interest. What's in it for me? So those in the lowest income brackets are the least likely to argue that too much is being spent of welfare or they're paying too much in taxes. Those with higher incomes are more likely to agree with those assessments. Religion. Many political issues are tough on matters of deep moral conviction or values. The motivation for action or opinion is not necessarily self-interest, but what is morally right. Many people argue that it's not up to the government to set moral standards. Their questions are often social issues as opposed to economic issues. It's typically whether or not, it's not what religion you are. It's not, Catholic versus Jew or something like that. It is whether or not religion plays a role in your life. Geographic distinction, where we live matters. People in the farm belt will talk about things differently than those in the city dwellers in Manhattan. Politicians who come from these areas represent different things, and much of the politics in Congress is about being responsive to differing geography-based opinions. So given the central role that public opinion plays in a democracy, it's important to find out what the public thinks. It's a very important business. Sometimes these polls are discounted by politicians who don't like the results, but they're pretty accurate these days. You know what your friends and family think about a lot of issues without actually conducting a poll most times. Simply talking to folks give you a sense of ideas and preferences most people are not shy about, and a lot of people will post them all over social media, right? We also tend to hang around with people who share views that we do, reinforcing the idea that everyone in the world thinks the same way as us. That's not necessarily true. It's just typically who we're around. Politicians are good talkers, but they're also good listeners. They learn constituent opinions from letters, from phone calls, from the emails they receive. They visit and talk with leaders and representatives and pick up signals from crowds, the way crowds respond to different themes. This direct contact puts politicians in touch with concerns that could be missed by polls. Members of Congress use a mix of sources to learn about public opinion, personal contacts, but also the polling data received when they run for office. For example, a sample, which is a portion of the population that's selected to participate in a poll. Based on what the sample says, the surveyor then makes an estimation of what everyone else thinks. If the sample is scientifically chosen to be representative of the whole population, this works well, and pollsters are trained to select a truly representative sample. Then you have a sample bias, the effect of having a sample that doesn't represent all segments of a population. If a pollster selects too many people from one portion of the population, this can happen. Politicians need to allow for the bias of their own sampling. If they're not effective at knowing how those they meet differ from the full public, they will get a misleading idea of public opinion. The scientific poll we now know today was developed in the 1930s, but newspapers and politicians have been trying to read public opinion for as long as we've had democracies. Straw polls. These are polls that attempt to determine who's ahead in a political race. These were the first effects at actually counting opinions. The name comes from the fact that a straw, when thrown up into the air, will indicate which way the wind is blowing. These polls help politicians predict which way the political winds are blowing and who will win an upcoming race. Today, polling is big business and relatively precise. All polls face the same two challenges: getting a good sample, which entails both sampling the right number of people and eliminating sample bias, and asking questions that yield valid results. No sample is perfect in matching the population from which it's drawn, but it should be close. Gallup said, okay, if you don't like the idea of a sample, then next time you go for a blood test, tell them to take it all. You got to think about samples. A poll's reliability is indicated by its sampling error, which is a number that indicates within what range of results of a poll are accurate. Typically, we'll say it's within the margin of error, plus or minus 3%. The larger the sample, the smaller the sampling error. To a certain point, modern polls now employ systematic random samples of the population whose opinions they want to describe. So random samples, these are samples chosen in such a way that any member of the population being polled has an equal chance of being selected. The chief form of sample bias in these is non-response bias, which is a skewing of data that occurs when there's a difference in opinion between those who choose to participate and those who do not. In current surveys, sometimes as few as 1/4 of those intended to be included in surveys actually participate. This can be blamed on, maybe you get a phone call and you have a hostility towards a telemarketer, or the increasing use of a caller ID so you don't even answer the phone. Most telephone surveys will likely have too many elderly women and too few younger men because the former are typically at home to answer when the interviewer calls. Pollsters deal with the problem of differential response rates, which yields a sample that does not look demographically like the population being sampled by weighting the sample to match what the census says the population is like. So weighting, adjusting to surveys during analysis so that selected demographic groups reflect their values in the population, which is usually measured by the census. This is done during the analysis of the results, over or underrepresenting groups that are multiplied in values that bring them into line with their actual numbers in the population. Technology is a pollster's friend, but it can also create unexpected challenges. Computers now can do the telephone interviewing, this is called robocalling, which is cheaper than using human interviewers, but it also is controversial and easily abused. Computers also provide another challenge in the opportunity in form of online surveys. Pollsters create panels of internet users who regularly log in to deliver their opinions on matters the pollsters select. They rely on strict probability samples, but this matches fairly well with traditional telephone interviewing. As increasing number of citizens rely on cell phones and the Telephone Consumer Protection Act limits the technologies that can be used to contact cell phone users, forbidding auto dialing, for instance, this becomes a little more challenging. There are three main points with respect to constructing a survey question. Respondents should be asked about things they know about and have thought about. Including a don't know category lessens the chance that a survey participant will try to bluff their way through a question they don't know anything about. The second is the questions should not be ambiguous. They should be straightforward questions. And the third is similar questions can yield surprisingly different answers, depending on the wording. The order in which questions are asked can often also change the results, such a simple factor as the number of choices offered for responses. Many people and organizations report the results of what they claim are measures of public opinion. To make sense of this, it's useful to know some basic polling terminology and the characteristic of different types of polls. Efforts to measure public opinion within a limited period of time using national representatives as a sample. So the time period could be as short as a few hours with results reported the next day, or extended over a period of weeks like academic polls. But the goal is the same: to achieve scientifically valid measures of knowledge, beliefs, or attitudes of the adult population. Many national polls are conducted by the media in conjunction with a professional polling organization. How does the public feel about the job that the president is doing? Other polling organizations will provide more in-depth surveys than those in the media polls. Some are designed to see how people feel about a particular topic or to how people develop certain attitudes and evaluate politics more generally. This provides a lot of the data for academic research on public opinion in America. Most well-funded campaigns begin with a benchmark poll, which is an initial poll on a candidate and issues on which campaign strategy is based and against which later polls are compared. These are used to gather baseline information about how well a candidate's known, what issue people are concerned about, as well as assessments of the opposition, especially if the opponent is an incumbent. Then they're using this in designing a campaign strategy. Presidential campaigns And some better funded statewide races conduct tracking polls, which are an ongoing series of surveys that follow changes in public opinion over time. Ongoing sets of interviews. Daily samples are too small for reliable generalization, but averaged over time, these become extremely helpful. A sudden change in a tracking poll might signal that an opponent's new ad is doing damage or that an interest group endorsement is having an effect. On an election night, media commenters often will call a race, declaring one candidate a winner, sometimes as soon as the voting booths are closed, but well before the official vote count has been reported. These predictions are made in part on the basis of what's called an exit poll, which are election-related questions asked of voters right after they vote. These are short questionnaires administered to a sample of voters in selected precincts after they vote. They focus on vote choice, a few demographic questions, and some issue preferences and evaluation of candidates. They've had mixed records in recent years, which leads news agencies to be cautious about how they're to be used. It's difficult to obtain a fully representative sample of voters. A number of opinion studies are wrongly presented as polls. Self-selection polls are things when respondents can select themselves into a survey rather than be chosen randomly, only tell you how a portion of the media outlet's audience who care enough to click on a mouse about an issue, that's only, you're only going to get a certain number of people responding. You have to have access to a site, care enough to be on the site, to pause long enough to participate. Nothing stops people from participating multiple times. So these kind of things are highly unrepresentative of the population as a whole. And then something called a push poll, which are polls that ask for a reaction to a hypothetical, almost always false information in order to manipulate public opinion. These are kind of used on a limited basis by pollsters and campaign strategists to find out how a voter might respond to negative information about a candidate, sometimes using the format as means of propaganda, like planting a negative idea about a candidate. These are usually conducted without any acknowledgement of who's sponsoring them, and the target candidate doesn't usually know about them, so they can't rebut the lies within them. Polls are conducted by social scientists, not so much to gauge and measure public opinion about elections as to deepen our understanding of public attitudes, especially on controversial issues where respondents know the socially accepted answer, but the survey questions are less likely to disclose their true opinions. How accurate are polls? For many issues, we have no objective measure against which to judge the accuracy of public opinion polls. But election predictors we can tell by the vote count whether or not the polls are correct. Almost all major polls have predicted the winner of presidential elections correctly since about 1980, except in the incredibly close election in the year 2000. They're not always correct to the percentage point, of course, but they're generally correct. The closer the poll is taken to election day, typically they become more accurate. They capture more of the late deciders. Politicians may act as though citizens are very well informed and attentive, but only some Americans really live up to our model of good citizenship that we talked about earlier. And those who do often belong disproportionately to the ranks of the well-educated, well-off, and older portions of the population. Were the founders right to limit the influence of the masses on the government? Do we want less informed and less coherent opinions represented in politics? Can democracy survive if it's only run by an educated elite? It may not be rational for all people to be deeply immersed in the minutiae of day-to-day politics. We have families, we have jobs, we have hobbies, we have little time for in-depth study of political issues. It might be rational for us to leave the political information gathering to others. Rational ignorance is the state of being uninformed about politics because of the cost in time and energy, but this doesn't mean we are ignorant. Citizens in general are pretty smart, and voters usually behave much more intelligently than we could ever guess from the answers to surveys about politics. But we use mental shortcuts, online processing, and the two-step flow of information. Online processing, which is not like dialing up online, is the ability to receive and evaluate information as events happen, kind of in line, allowing us to remember our evaluation even if we've forgotten the specific events that caused it. Many evaluations are made on the fly, and we often assemble impressions and reactions while we're just leading our lives. You don't remember why you don't like something, but you remember that you don't, or for example. And then the two-step flow of information, the process by which citizens take their political cues from more well-informed opinion leaders. We can only absorb a fraction of the mass amount of information that's sent out by a politician and the media, and even then, it's sometimes hard to interpret it. So we rely on opinion leaders, people we know who know more about certain topics than we do and whose advice we trust and seek out and follow. If you're buying a car, you're going to ask somebody who you know who drives it, hey, do you like that car? What do you think about it? Same sort of thing. We sometimes get opinions online from social media, from blogs, from comments made and reviews made by others. Technology allows us to sort of ask many experts. The same things happens with politics. We behave as though we are well informed without being required to expand all of our resources that being informed entails. All right, guys, that is it for this week. Look for your quiz posted tomorrow and your exam posted next week. As always, please feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I'll see you back the week after next with your lecture on political parties. All right, bye.